This presentation is a slightly different format. Mark, who is very close to completing his PhD, we thought we'd give him, about time too, eh? We thought we'd give him a little bit longer, so we've given him half an hour, and then unfortunately Steph Stiley, who was going to present on her Masters, has pulled out. So Mark's going to cover some of that work as well, and we're going to give him 45 minutes. Now, which is good, but we'll probably cut that back by exactly 4 minutes and 15. Mark, you got that? Yep. So Mark's recently, we've lost Mark to the Otways, unfortunately. He's headed north for warmer climes with his beloved and a, consistent and better paycheck. We know as a group that that's a mistake, and in time he will learn that that's a mistake and come back. But it's been a pretty spectacular bit of work that Mark's going to present today, so I hope you really enjoy it. And it's the culmination of not just a PhD, but a lot of years of working in this environment. So enjoy it. Thanks, Mark, for coming down today.
Okay. Can everybody hear me okay? Yep, cool. Okay, let's get cracking. Lots to talk about. I'm going to talk about some of the work that I've been doing as part of my PhD in the past couple of years. And the concept's quite simple: predators, prey, and fire, and how do those interactions change. Now, for those who haven't seen a long-nosed potteroo, that's what they look like. They appear in the craziest locations, everywhere from the heath right up into the wet forest, and sometimes even on a t-shirt. And they come in a variety of sizes. So you'll get your bog standard regular, just like a cup of coffee, but every now and again there's a grande stomping around the bush. And if you're very, very lucky, like I've been, you might observe a baby chino. And we know where there's lots and lots of potteroos to be found. It's only about 30 kilometres away, down near the local township of Gellibrand, the Carlisle Heath. And the Carlisle Heath is magical. It is dominated by stands of the austral grass tree up on the ridges, sandy soils. And it's not just great potteroo habitat. We're still seeing really good records of a wide range of other ground-dwelling mammals that we know are having a hard time elsewhere in their distribution. We get the southern brown bandicoot, the white-footed dunnart, the swamp antechinus. They're all still there, and they're all still occurring in quite good numbers. So it's an important landscape to try and get management right. But management in the Carlisle is tricky because it's flammable. That same structure that appears to give these ground-dwelling mammals really, really good refuge from invasive predators like cats and foxes, it also leads to interconnected fuel loads and quite severe fires, even in the middle of winter. So it's quite a challenge to get things right. How do we do fire in a Carlisle to maintain the high biodiversity values whilst reducing wildfire risk? It was definitely put on the radar recently as a wildfire risk to local communities. So this was a fire that started from a lightning strike back in 2020 that made a race towards the local township of Gellibrand, moving a couple of kilometres in a space of just a few hours. So we really want to get it right from a wildfire risk perspective. But it's a brilliant landscape from an ecological research perspective to understand how fire changes predator-prey dynamics, because the post-fire environment is very, very different. So you've got very, very structurally complex environments before the fire, but after, it can look a little bit like a moonscape. Much more open, easily facilitating access, and potentially making quite productive hunting grounds for invasive predators. And fortunately, Darcy did the heavy lifting here earlier, just acknowledging that there is growing interest in this interaction between invasive predators and fire. And there's been a whole bunch of research coming out. We're starting to wrap our head around it. We're starting to develop a mechanistic understanding of how these interactions occur, but there's still a lot to learn. And if you had to ask me, how do I summarise my whole PhD into one simple question, it looks a bit like this. How do predators and prey respond to prescribed fire in a Carlisle? And I'll try and answer that question over the next 40-ish minutes. We're going to do it in 3 stages. Act 1, we're going to talk about the predators. Act 2, we're going to talk about the prey. And Act 3, we're going to talk about the options. So, the predators, cats and foxes. When we went out and we started this research program, as Darcy mentioned, we knew there was a huge gap in the literature. There were very few examples where people were intimately following individual animals before, during, and after fire via GPS collars. And we really wanted to fill that gap as best we could. So we got out there and we caught as many cats and foxes as we possibly could. We attached GPS collars to 11 feral cats and 13 foxes between 2020 and 2023. And we were collecting information on them hourly. So every single hour, these GPS collars would take a fix, and we would have information about where that animal was at that time. Over the course of 9 months, which was about the battery length we could expect with these collars, it ends up being thousands of data points per individual predator, so we can see where they've been and when they were there. And we learned just a lot of interesting baseline information about predators in this system. Feral cats, we learned that they had really large home range sizes, about 15 square kilometres. One of the animals almost had a home range of upwards of 30 square kilometres, so really, really large home ranges, but really low daily movement rates. So on any given day, we might expect a feral cat to actually only use a very small proportion of their very large home range. They're not covering it every single night and maintaining a defendable territory or anything like that. And we also learned from some supplementary work that there simply weren't many cats out there to begin with, about 0.3 cats per square kilometre or so. What about foxes? They had smaller home ranges, so about 6 square kilometres or so on average. Some outliers upwards of about 13 square kilometres, but most of them hung around that 6K mark. But in contrast to cats, foxes had really high daily movement rates. So every single day, on average, they were covering almost the entirety of their home range. So they're covering their area really, really frequently. Not unexpected, given what we know about foxes as canids, but certainly quite the contrast to the feral cats in the system. And there were also not that many foxes in the Carlisle Heath either. So that was quite an interesting thing to learn. Made trapping them a bit of a pain in the backside, but I'm not bitter. We also learned a few interesting things about how invasive predators use this system. What we learned with the foxes is that they will certainly exploit anthropogenic resources when they're available. They will make trips out of the bush and into local farmlands to hunt for things like rabbits. We saw that on 3 separate occasions with these 3 animals here. And we also saw it with the cats as well. So we saw, for example, Hades down here back in 2022. He was making regular trips down to some forestry that had just been cleared. Still living in the bush, but making these frequent trips out to the south where potentially life was a little bit easier. How about their baseline habitat preferences? Well, we're going to see a figure here wherein each individual animal is going to get a point, and if that point is on the line, on 0, it means they're indifferent to the feature that we're going to be talking about. If it's above the line, it means that they avoid that area, and if it's below the line, it means they like to be close to that area. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at their selection for roads up the top and being close to water down the bottom. So what do we see with roads? Really strong attraction across the board. 13 animals where we had enough information to estimate resource selection for roads. 12 out of 13 of them demonstrated really strong preferences to being close to roads. What about water? Well, we found for the cats, it was pretty consistent. We found feral cats would generally tend to like being quite close to water courses, streams, gullies, places like that. But with foxes, it was a little bit more mixed. So half of the animals preferred to be quite close to these landscape features, and half of them tended to avoid them. So probably depends on what's available to them. So just in summary about baseline information about predators in the Carlisle, seems like life is pretty hard for them. They have really large home ranges. Their activity is not homogeneous through that area. It's quite restricted to linear features where it's easier to move through. And it's a pretty compelling reason for why there's probably such good records of ground-dwelling mammals to begin with. Life seems to be pretty hard for predators in the Carlisle. But what happens when we throw fire into the mix? When we wanted to look at how we might describe invasive predator responses to fire, we figured we'd come at it in 2 complementary ways that are different. First, we wanted to look at their site use using remote sensing cameras, and we also wanted to see how they responded to burnt areas and how they, if they were attracted to burnt areas, but also unburnt vegetation near the burnt areas, which I'll go into in a second. Cameras. We went out and we just chucked a truckload of cameras out into this system in a structured way, I should mention, but we had systematic deployments. So cameras were placed over areas that we knew would burn through collaboration and communication with the FFMVIC and looking at the JFMP. We knew these areas would burn, and we would get out there and we would deploy cameras, 200 metre spacing, and ideally have them out there for about a month or so. And we did this both before and after the fire. Before the fire, these camera grids were out there about a month before the fire or so, on average. But after the fire, we got them out there as soon as we possibly could. On average, that was about 3 days after the fire where we had these camera deployments operating and collecting information about what was going on in that system. We're going to see some other figures here, and what we're going to see is both feral cats and foxes' site use or occupancy probability before and after the fire. If we see a point down the bottom, it means that they barely used that site, and if we see a point up the top, it means that we could expect them quite frequently on the cameras. So what did we see with the cats? We saw a positive trend, but it's pretty uncertain. And this was largely driven by that low density of feral cats to begin with. We just had bugger all detections, even though cameras were out there for a month to 6 weeks or so. So positive, but slightly uncertain. We can come back to that in a second. Foxes, however, very strong clean signal. What we're seeing here with the dotted lines are their site use of unburnt cameras before the fire and cameras that would eventually burn before the fire, so not a lot of difference there. But afterwards, the sites that burnt, much more likely to detect a fox. It was actually about a 6-fold increase in your chances of detecting a fox at burnt cameras. Still an increase at unburnt cameras as well, but a little bit more uncertainty there. But the GPS collars are the really interesting part, okay? So cameras, they're not perfect. What happened with the GPS collars and the animals that we're following? We had 3 feral cats respond to 2 separate fires each. So in total, we had about 6 occasions where we could describe using GPS data what feral cats would do in response to fire. With foxes, we had fewer occasions, so we had 2 individuals respond to a single fire each, and that left us with 2 occasions where we could intimately describe what foxes would do when exposed to prescribed fire. I should take this time to mention that 1 cat and 1 fox were perfectly placed to respond to fires. I was so excited, and then they were shot. You can't really control for that. Just an important reminder, though, that invasive predators, sure, they're the top dogs ecologically, but they're not free from sources of mortality themselves. They're not free from downward pressure, and it's something we need to take into account. And also, we had quite a few animals just go completely AWOL from us out of the study region. So animals that we caught, we tracked for a few days, we knew they were still around, and then they disappeared and they dropped off the face of the earth. For most of these animals, we don't know where they ended up. But one of these animals was shot by a landholder after dispersing over 40 kilometres away. So it just gives you an idea of the scale at which these populations of invasive predators might actually be operating on. And we wanted to look at how these animals would use burnt areas. So of course we wanted to see if they were attracted into the burnt areas themselves. But as a little extra thing that we wanted to add on, we wanted to see how cat and foxes might be using the unburnt vegetation immediately adjacent to the burn areas as well. So we decided to give them, the burn areas, a bit of a 100-metre buffer, and this way we can see if they were attracted to burnt areas or if they're attracted to vegetation near burnt areas. And same sort of deal, so slightly different to before because now we're looking at a categorical covariate, not a continuous one. If we see a point above the line, that means that they are attracted to this feature. Below, on the line, ditto, indifferent, I will use this feature as its availability dictates, and if it's below the line, we're going to see avoidance of that particular landscape feature. And we're going to look at it, their selection for unburnt areas near the burnt areas, and we're going to follow it through time. So we're going to cut up that 9 months into monthly subsets and see what happens before and after fire. So for feral cats, we end up with something that looks a little bit like this. As you can see in this first month post-fire, or the first 2 months, pretty positive across the board. So that means that these animals, for the most part, were attracted to, interestingly, both burnt and unburnt components of the post-fire landscape. How about the foxes? Pretty consistent again. That first month post-fire, those first 2 months post-fire seems to be where all the action is. And what we saw on the part of foxes is a bit more of a preference for the burnt areas rather than the unburnt areas. That coincides with the camera data really, really well. We had quite a few occasions where animals could plausibly have responded to a fire, but chose not to. Ursula, over here, she was living only a couple of 100 metres away from quite a large fire, yet didn't bother with it whatsoever. Some of the other animals like Scar in the aqua and Ursula down here in the red, no departures from their normal movement behaviour. There's no sign that these animals were detecting a fire kilometres away, uprooting their lives and making these large commutes to exploit that recently burnt area. That's a good thing. It means we might only have to worry about the locals. Foxes, why burnt areas in particular? Why were they so keen on going into burnt areas? Well, it may be due to how foxes like to get about, find and capture their prey. They move and pursue predators. And fire can allow access to areas that they might not have really bothered with before the fire. We know how structurally complex the Carlisle is, and we know how restricted fox behaviour or fox movements can be when most of the landscape is really thick and structurally complex. And so we think that the fire may have, by opening up the area and simplifying vegetation, it may have facilitated access into new markets effectively, new prey bases that they can exploit. And it provided them likely really good opportunities to pursue prey that were still living in these areas, moving between or within burnt areas. How about cats? Why were they so keen on going particularly to the unburnt vegetation near burn edges? Well, again, we think it might be due to the fact that feral cats do differ in how they go about finding and capturing their prey. They're often sit, wait and ambush predators. Although there's large dietary overlap between cat and foxes in terms of the size of the prey items they like to go for, on average, cats can prefer smaller prey species. And we know smaller prey items, things like rodent and antechinus, will often seek refuge immediately in unburnt vegetation immediately adjacent to burnt areas or gullies. And so the unburnt vegetation near burnt edges might actually be the sweet spot for cats. Yes, there's still vegetation there, but these animals, they're pretty good at capturing their prey. They may simply have better success hunting where the prey actually is. So what we learned about cat and foxes is the fact that they can both respond to the fire positively, and they can respond to the same fire. So we had several occasions of cat and foxes tracked by GPS responding to the same fire. There wasn't a lot of indication that there was some, mesopredator downwards pressure from the foxes suppressing the response of cats. We didn't really see that. And we also learned that fires don't have to be large to elicit a response. Some of the fires that we observed these animals responding to were really small, 5% of their home range or so, and they would still respond really positively and still use these areas disproportionately. But it was an intense response, but it was short-lived and localised. It seems like those first 2 months are really where all the action happens. And at least in our system, we didn't see what Hugh McGregor did. We didn't see what he saw up in Northern Australia, where animals were making these really large extraterritorial forays. Phew, that's a good thing, again. Concerning, but there are options, but we can get to that later. This paper hopefully will be submitted to a journal really soon with a super cool title. Placeholder. So that's Act 1, that's the predators. Act 2, the prey, long-nosed potoroos. In order to actually follow these animals before, during and after fire, just the same way that we did with cats, we had to get out there and we had to catch them. And that meant wire cage trapping. We had to physically get our hands on the animals. It was hard yakka. This is thick country, and sometimes we would have to go several hundred metres off into the bush to deploy these traps in a systematic grid. And I just wanted to acknowledge that there is no way we would have gotten the capture success and sort of the work done that we did without the heroic efforts, particularly of CC interns over the past couple of years. These guys have helped me immensely, and it has been a really positive learning experience for us all. And we wanted to take a similar approach with the prey. We wanted the data types to be really similar between predators and prey, so we wanted to follow them intimately before, during and after the fire as well. Same fixed schedule, hourly, but much smaller animal, much shorter battery life. So we could only follow these animals for about 6-ish weeks or so on average. And the really interesting thing is no one's actually GPS tracked long-nosed potoroos before, so even just doing this, even in the absence of fire, we learnt a lot about how long-nosed potoroos move in the Carlisle. We learnt that they had home ranges much larger than previously expected based on prior literature, prior studies trying to estimate their space use. And we learnt, unsurprisingly, that males had much larger home ranges than females. And that there was very limited signs of territoriality. They're effectively living all stacked up on top of each other. But what happens when we throw fires into the mix? Well, what we did is we attached GPS collars to 52 long-nosed potoroos in total over 3 years, and we exposed 40 of those animals to fire. And 12 of these animals were GPS tracked in areas far enough away from the fire where we could consider them normal, a baseline, an experimental control upon which we can compare to. We replicated our approach at 8 burns that were quite small in scale, so between 20 and 50 hectares or so, and we had replication of individual animals within each burn. So some burns had 8 potoroos collared, some burns had 2, most of them had somewhere between 4 and 6. And we wanted to stagger our GPS data collection simply that it was a little bit more skewed towards the post-fire movements. We wanted to know a little bit more about what would happen after fire. So with our 6-week deployment time, we ideally got 1 to 2 weeks before and 3 to 4 weeks of post-fire data to work with. And GPS data is great because we can ask a whole lot of interesting questions. Do they survive is the big one, but do they change their home range size? Do they move more? Where do they go? Do they use burnt areas? GPS data gives us options, and we can start to really tease in and intimately describe how they change their movements and their survival before and after fire. So the big one, did they survive? Unfortunately not. The results were pretty clear. Animals exposed to fire were 3 times less likely to survive their collar deployments relative to those animals that had no fire exposure whatsoever. So if you're a collared animal and you're exposed to fire, you had about a 1 in 3 shot of living the next 4 weeks. We also found a negative association between how much of their pre-fire home range burnt, fire exposure, and survival. If more and more of your home range burns, your chances of surviving the next 4 weeks start to decline pretty dramatically. How about their home range size? Do they change their home range size? Each individual animal on this graph is going to be a point, and if that point is above the line, it means they've increased their home range size in the post-fire period. If it's below the line, it means they've shrunk and they've decreased their home range size. I'm going to look at this along a gradient of fire exposure along the x-axis. So animals over this side had more of their home range burnt relative to animals on this side. And we're going to look at it at males and females. So what did we see? A bit of a dog's breakfast, a bit of everything. We saw large variation in home range size changes before and after fire. Some animals increased, some animals decreased. There were some broad trends that we were able to tease out, namely that females generally reduce their home range size, regardless of fire exposure, whereas males were a little bit more likely to actually increase their home range size in response to fire. Do they move more? Nope, not really. Again, a bit of variation, but on average, at a population level, you'd be hard-pressed to say there was a consistent thing they did with their movement rates after fire. It probably depends on local context. How about home range location? Where did they go? Well, we're going to see another graph where each individual animal, again, is going to be a point. And if your point is really high up on the x-axis, it means that your pre- and post-fire home ranges look a bit like this, almost identical. If your point is down the middle, it means your pre-fire home range shares some similarity with your post-fire home range, but it's also changed slightly. And if you're down towards 0, it means your post-fire home range shares very little similarity in space to your pre-fire home range. So, where did long-nosed potoroos go? Nowhere, really. On average, regardless of fire exposure down here, really extreme high site fidelity. Their post-fire home ranges were effectively stacked up on top of their pre-fire home ranges. They stuck around. And there's potentially some good reasons for this, which we can go into in a little bit. How do they feel about burnt areas? Are they attracted to them or do they avoid them? Same deal. We know the story above the line. I'm attracted. Below the line, I'm going to avoid it. And if we look at it as a function of how much of their pre-fire home range burnt, fire exposure, we actually see this really interesting trend where if you've got small amounts of your home range burnt, you're actually quite likely to be attracted into the burn area and use burnt areas more than its availability would dictate. But after about 30% or so of your home range burning, you're a bit more likely to start avoiding burnt areas. And we weren't expecting this attraction, which is really interesting. So, why stay? Why are they just hanging on after fire in the exact same areas? It doesn't seem like a very clever decision. Well, firstly, I think we have to acknowledge that fire might not necessarily limit food resources for long-nosed potoroos in this system. This study was taken at a time where fungi makes up the large majority of their dietary content. And when we get out and we start to deploy cameras after fire, so we're out there just a couple of days after fire, you'll see these really fresh spoil piles of fresh diggings of mycophagous mammals, likely potoroos. And you'll see the shells of this fungi, Mesophilia. And there's something really interesting about this fungi. High fire temperatures, high soil temperatures changes its odour profile. So potentially you've got a whole bunch of fungi out there if the fire's particularly hot, waiting underground, releasing this beautiful smell that might be attracting prey, or long-nosed potoroos in this case, into the burn areas to forage for them. And of course, with all the removal of vegetation in the way, it might be pretty easy to access this fungi as well. So there might be some important ecological reasons for why animals A, stuck around, and B, ventured into burnt areas, even though it's a dangerous thing to do. We also have to acknowledge that just uprooting your life and moving, trying to find a home range somewhere else is an incredibly risky thing to do, particularly if you have lots of neighbours, particularly if there's low availability of vacant territory, and also if you don't know much about what's around you. This same structural complexity that looks like it gives really good refuge for these prey, for these species like long-nosed potoroos, makes it really, really hard. Your perceptual range, your ability to know the quality and status of habitat much further beyond your usual home range is really limited in structurally complex environments. So perhaps it's a case of the better the devil you know. And then finally, there may be a bit of a decoupling of perceived risk and actual predation risk. What I mean by this is prey species like long-nosed potoroos, they will often rely on indirect cues of predator activity and presence within their landscape. So things like scat and hair and urine, etc. And they'll get a bit of a whiff and get a bit of an idea of where's a dangerous place to go. Okay, so they can get a bit of an idea of where they might be at risk. Fire might etch-a-sketch that landscape clean, okay, and remove all of these cues that our prey species rely upon. And those cues might take a little bit of time to start to build back up again and give our prey species an accurate reflection of where predators are likely to be. And so we think potentially potoroos were making ventures out into burnt areas because they potentially perceived it as not as risky a thing to do, or perceived it as a less risky thing to do than it actually was. What we do know is this: they stuck around and they did continue to venture into and between burnt areas, and it simply wasn't a great strategy. We think this is one of our long-nosed potoroos that was GPS collared, Mad Eye Moody from 2022. He was last known alive only half an hour before this image was taken, quite close to where this camera was deployed, and then we got this picture. And as mentioned, as you saw with the camera trapping results, we were detecting foxes quite frequently at these fires, particularly within the areas that actually burned. The contribution of cats to the high mortality rates that we observed, a little less clear. We have to acknowledge that we don't have any smoking gun information linking them directly to predation events like we do with foxes. I should also mention we found several long-nosed potoroos actually buried and cached underground. This is a behaviour that we know foxes will do in times of food surplus. This one has just been recently accepted, thankfully. Yay! So expect that one in your email inboxes really soon. Can't wait to talk about it in a little bit more detail. So we know the immediate effects of prescribed fire on potoroo survival aren't exactly great, but what about the population in the long term? So we agree. We think it's a really important question to try and tackle. And so back in 2021, we got in contact and developed a project led by Steph Silly, a master's student from the University of Melbourne, wherein we would go back out to some of these areas that had burnt 1 and 2 years post-fire and try and estimate potoroo density to see just how many animals were in these landscapes after fire. And the great thing about this approach is that we're censusing the entire population. We're not just following a handful of individuals. We're getting a much better idea of sort of population level impacts. What she found was that there are still a lot of pots, which is great. So she had extraordinarily high capture rates across all of the sites that she went to. 735 captures over 2 years, lots and lots of individuals, so about 145 individual potoroos were captured. And we had microchips inserted into them to know that they were individuals. So that's really exciting. So not a lot of evidence there that the population as a whole is starting to decline. What some of our results start to look like here, this is a control block, so just a site that had no fire exposure. She just wanted to go out, estimate density. What she found was that this site in 2022 was absolutely crawling in pots, but in 2023, it just went up and up and up, upwards of close to 200 potoroos per square kilometre. So what this tells us is that even between years, even in the absence of fire, we can get really high variation in potoroo population density. How about the sites that burnt? She went and estimated density at 2 of these sites. What she found at the first site was that there were certainly appeared to be less potoroos relative to the control site, but that trend was increasing through time. And you might look at these 2 sites and go, well, the fire absolutely knocked them down and they're slowly coming back. But at one of the other burn sites, we saw densities that were really quite close to what we observed at our control site as well. So this is great. It potentially means that Potteroo population resilience is quite high, even though the impacts were severe. Right time, right place. Just to explain all of these results on the part of the prey altogether, we have to acknowledge that populations aren't static through time. They change and they ebb and they flow depending on environmental conditions. And we have to acknowledge we've had some pretty good wet years in the lead up and duration of this study. So perhaps our study was undertaken at a time where we could observe severe impacts, but the Potteroo population resilience was quite high, and their ability to recover may have been sort of pretty good. There's a couple of things also about the research that may have contributed to sort of this immediate recovery, or this strong apparent recovery that we've observed. The fires that we worked with were broadly distributed in space and time, so they weren't just all one after another, all at the same period of time. And there were low predator densities and broad distributions throughout the area. And let's give Potteroo some credit. They're very fecund. They can absolutely pump out babies and joeys when the conditions are good. They've got a relatively homogeneous distribution throughout the area, lots of neighbours potentially easily able to move in, and a flexible diet. But there's some larger questions that remain unknown. I am an optimistic person, but I don't want to always be optimistic, because we have to entertain what might happen if population resilience was low and we had fires. What might we expect from long-nosed Potteroo responses to fire if, say, it's been a few years of drought? Potentially, they're a little less resilient to deal with these impacts. We also don't really know a lot about the mechanisms of population recovery, so we don't know whether or not it was in situ survival or ex situ recruitment that really contributed to this apparent recovery that we observed. And I think the big question, which I'll come to towards the end here, is what would happen if we intervened? And that brings me nicely to Act 3, the options. We have to acknowledge that biodiversity values are but one of the wide range of values that need to be taken into account when we're planning a fire regime for an area like the Otways. And also, I think it's important to acknowledge that not burning the Carlisle whatsoever isn't a great option. We know a large chunk of the plant species that occur throughout this area often need fire in order to replenish their seed bank and promote mass flowering events. And if we don't burn whatsoever, then the wildfire risk potentially might increase through time, to the point where we have a wildfire and the entire landscape is torched all in one go. So it's tricky, but I think it's important also to acknowledge that we're in the driver's seat and we do have options. Whilst we might not know where wildfire will occur, we certainly will know well ahead in advance where prescribed fire will go. And so we have some options that we might be able to link with prescribed fire to get a better outcome for our for our native prey species. I'm not going to go into artificial refuges. Darcy covered that wonderfully, which is a really important tool in the kit that we want to entail. But here's some of the other things that I think might help. Option number 1, make it a bit harder to find a burn. Burning from roads, getting an edge off, has a lot of benefits, and it's pretty standard practice. It's good for safety, it's good for containment, it's good for access to resources. But we know in the Carlisle, both cats and foxes will heavily use roads. And so if our fires always start from a road, if the road always ends up as the boundary, then potentially we're making it really easy for these invasive predators to both encounter and exploit those recently burnt areas, particularly foxes with that high daily movement rate. So here's a bit of an example here from one of the fires in 2021, just demonstrating that we have now effectively created a bit of a highway through some pretty thick country, and that likely contributed to the higher mortality rates that we observed, or at least increased potential encounter rates between predators and prey. So that might be something we can play with and we can manipulate a little bit in the future. Option number 2, level the playing field. Potteroos, cats and foxes, they have coexisted in the Carlisle for quite a long time. They haven't all just been lumped together there in the past couple of years. Give them some credit. And Potteroos are certainly not clever. I'll be the first to admit that. But they're not powerless as well. They do have strategies, they have behaviours, they have capacity to avoid being eaten. One of the things that we know about fires in this region, we're getting reasonably good at it, is that when we want to, often we can keep fire out of a gully by relying on natural fuel moisture differentials. So we can pretty safely assume most of the time that gullies will remain unburnt, but are they safe? That's an important question. This is one of the fires, again, back from 2022, quite large scale, and you can see the areas that didn't burn align nicely with the availability of riparian areas throughout this burn. So we certainly had good gully retention, quite patchy. But the post-fire movement data from one of our cats, Gaston, in the orange here, suggests that these unburnt gullies were exactly where he was responding positively to that fire. He was hunting in the gullies, not just the burnt areas. So gullies might not always be safe. Gullies often look a bit like this in that system, quite open. They're wet, they will remain unburnt, but pretty hard pressed to say that they might make suitable refuge for a species that relies on really structurally complex environments up to about a metre or so. So we know some country might remain unburnt, but just because it's unburnt doesn't mean it's safe. Perhaps we need to be a little bit proactive about trying to retain at least some patches of structurally complex vegetation to level the playing field and give our native prey some refuge. Finally, we can integrate lethal predator control. This is a big one, lots of conversation around this at the moment, and for good reason. It's based on sound rationale. If we control predators immediately before the fire happens, then perhaps we can remove the residents before they do their damage. And the great thing about this approach is, again, because of the JFMP and the way fires are planned, we know where prescribed fire is likely to be, and we have the option to be either proactive or reactive with when we do this intensive localised lethal predator control. It's not going to be perfect. Rapid immigration, difficulty of control, particularly cats, and costs could complicate things, but it's also largely unknown as to whether or not this will really help native prey survival and population persistence. So all I would say is if we're going to consider doing this, then let's learn from it. Monitoring is vital. We really need to link aim and outcome before we start to roll this out everywhere. And just to wrap things up, we've seen a bit of a hint of success. I'm going to give you a bit of a case study where many of these options simultaneously occurred without actually deliberately meaning to, but it's quite interesting. So this is one of the fires from 2023 that was exclusively lit via aerial drip torch, which means it didn't have an edge, it didn't start from the road. It was started from incendiaries dropped out of a helicopter. It was patchy at the Potteroo scale. There was retention of both structurally complex environment as well as reasonably large burnt areas. They were pretty patchily distributed. We had no response from a local fox that could have responded to this fire. He had a home range really close to the boundaries, didn't bother with it whatsoever. And we had 0 cat detections post-fire at the camera grids at this fire. We did have 5 fox detections after fire at this camera grid, but 4/5 of them were over a month after the fire event. So potentially it was a pretty hard fire to access and exploit. And of the 8 animals that we had GPS collared here, every single one of them survived. This is easily our best survival data, so potentially a bit of a hint of success. Finally, option 4, learn more, try more. We are really only starting to scratch the surface here as to how these animals, or how predator-prey dynamics are influenced by fire, but we know more than we did yesterday. And I should take this time to acknowledge that the stakes are really high because many of the post-fire movement behaviours we observed with long-nosed potoroos have been observed in other macropods or potoroids, things like bettongs, long-nosed bandicoot, the rufous bettong, eastern bettong, woylie, etc. They've all shown really high site fidelity post-fire, and they've shown similar levels of post-fire mortality where foxes are present. So we really want to wrap our heads around how predator and prey dynamics change after fire and what we can do about it. It's been a huge journey. It wouldn't have been possible without the support of, just a whole wide range of organisations, helpers in the field, so on and so forth. So thank you to everyone who helped out intimately on this project. And just one last thing. 8 years ago, Shane Neal, Lizzie Cork, Jack Pascoe, they took a shot on a weird ecologist, wanted to get a crack into the field. And they gave me a formative experience as an ecologist that simply cannot be replaced. I've come so far in those 8 years, and I'll just simply say thank you. Thank you, Lizzie. Thank you, Jack. Thank you, Shane. And that's all.
You should have seen the way he lobbed in for his job interview.
That's what I mean by you took a shot.
Yeah, it was a fair punt. Thanks, Mark. You said we're scratching the surface, but you've had a fair itch at it. It's a pretty impressive piece of work for a PhD. Can we have any questions briefly. Tim here is going to run around if people raise their hands with a microphone. That is a very convenient place. Thank you.
Hi Mark, Jill Stewart from Dean Smash. We've got a farm out there. Just asking when the foxes increased in numbers in farmland, whether that coincided with the lambing.
I can't say that they increased in their numbers or anything like that. We didn't estimate density through time. We just know that they used them. It entirely makes sense that the profitability of using an agricultural landscape is going to be dynamic through time. And yeah, absolutely makes sense that where there's lambing, where there's reproduction of rabbits, etc., that they might be more likely to use those areas relative to other parts of the year.
Maybe one more question. I did realise then that I did promise that I would repeat the questions. Apologies. That one was about lambing and fox densities.
Thanks so much, Matt. It was a really great presentation. I was also quite intrigued about the results that you got for burnt and unburnt, that increase regardless of fire, and wondered whether season or potteroo reproduction or other species reproduction had any kind of influence as a variable in the background. But I really wanted to just pick up that really fascinating result that you had with the potteroos and the macrophagus fungi, and to just think about the consequences of the potteroos not being in that landscape and not then being the kind of dispersers of those fungal spores through a landscape that's been burnt. And we see time and time again fungi not recolonising for a long, long time where there's been fire, whether it be cool or hot, particularly hot. And so I just think it's amazing to see that role of the potteroo as being the kind of fungal dispersers to facilitate the fungi to return to those landscapes to help then all of those species recover in post-fire landscapes. So that was a really cool thing. Thanks, Matt. Really interesting.
No worries.
I'm not going to try and paraphrase that question, but did you want to have a comment?
It was just a little bit more of a comment than a question, but it was a bit more about just how interesting it was that potteroos were going out into burnt areas and exploiting that fungi, because that fungi has a really important relationship with the establishment of canopy trees in that system. So it's a point I like to bring up sometimes when talking with friends and family. They'll go, why are we worried about the potteroos? And I'm like, yes, they're cute, but my main concern is that if they disappear, we might not see the full ecological ramifications of that for upwards of 50, 60, 70 years or so. If that function has gone, the animal might go, but the consequences of the function being taken out of that system are unknown and potentially really scary. So, yeah.
All right, mate, enough from you. Thanks, Mark.